August 23rd, 1912, Opelousas, Louisiana. The Dunbar family, that of Leslie and Percy, and their son Robert, or Bobby as they called him, and their son Alonzo, would go on a fishing trip to the nearby Swayze Lake, some 30 minutes away. And it's on this fishing trip that one of the more enduring early 20th century mysteries would occur, when 4-year-old Bobby Dunbar would disappear. And because this case is so old, and because of the early conflicting reports, how he vanished is not even certain. But the news was huge at a time in 1912 when things were still fairly slow. World War I was still 2 years away, and the case of a little boy that seemingly vanished into thin air caused quite a stir, with basically every newspaper covering it. Everyone was following the story and kept an eye out for Bobby. Massive searches were carried out all over the area and state, and there just wasn't much to go by. Basically, all they found was a set of bare footprints and Bobby's hat leading out of the swamps to a railroad bridge where there had been reports of a strange man lurking the area. So detectives naturally assumed he had been abducted. Soon, the story would fall to the wayside, but that would all change 8 months later, when authorities would be alerted to a strange man traveling through Mississippi with a boy that looked pretty similar to Bobby. This man was named William Walters, a handyman that traveled across the country working on different projects. He mainly specialized in repairing pianos and organs. William was soon approached by authorities who began questioning him about the boy that was with him. William would tell authorities his name was Charles Bruce Anderson, although he was known by his middle name. Bruce was the son of a woman who worked for the Williams family. That woman's name was Julia Anderson, and according to William, she had just willingly granted custody of Bruce to go with him as a traveling companion, which makes this time period just seem so much more weird, and makes the decision of his alleged mother Julia to allow her son to randomly travel with this man seem questionable. But they did find Julia and ask her, and she confirmed that Bruce was her son, and she gave him permission to travel with this strange man. But police weren't buying William's story, and he was arrested, and Bruce, well, I guess Bobby now, was sent back home to the Dunbars to identify. And here's where the varying accounts continue. First, some newspapers would state that when this boy seen Leslie, he would shout "Mother" before rushing up and throwing his arms around her. Conversely, other papers stated that Leslie was unsure if it was Bobby, while Bobby, or Bruce, just cried, while others claimed that neither parent were sure if it was Bobby. Likewise, some papers reported that Bobby's brother Alonzo instantly recognized him and called him Bobby and gave him a kiss, while other sources stated Alonzo showed no signs that he recognized him. Regardless, this boy was left with the family, and the next day, after Leslie gave him a bath, she would positively identify him based on scars and moles that she found. So after this, the town threw Bobby a homecoming parade, and everyone would live happily ever after, except that's not what happened. Soon, Julia Anderson would leave her home in North Carolina to go to Louisiana to try and clear William's name, and assert that Bobby was Bruce and her son, which must have been difficult for her to do at this time, because Julia was an unwed mother, which was very scandalous at this time. But she told authorities she worked for William's family and had allowed him to take Bruce on a 2-day trip, but had not consented for him to be gone as long as he was. To test her, they brought Julia 5 different boys around the same age as her alleged son, including this mystery boy. When presented, this boy did not give any indication that he knew Julia. She would point to him though, and ask if this was the boy traveling with William, and authorities would not answer her, leading Julia to question herself and finally say she was unsure if it was Bruce. The next day, she would see the boy again, and he was told to strip down, and she now identified him as Bruce by the same scars and moles that Leslie had. Julia was 100% sure this was her son, but by this point, word had already leaked out that she couldn't identify him the first day. Plus, the papers were roasting her about being an unwed mother, because if she was an unwed mother, she obviously had no morals, and if she could do such a thing, she was probably lying about this, or at least, that's what the papers claimed. Even worse was Julia had 2 other children out of wedlock prior to this, but they had died young. This boy was presumably her only child, but unless Julia was willing to take it to court, there was nothing she could do, and since she was a poor farmhand, She could not fight a long legal battle, and the Dunbars could. She did return back to Louisiana to at least clear William's name in the kidnapping trial, and actually, residents from Poplarville, Mississippi, where he had been arrested, also testified. These witnesses would state under oath that William and this boy had been in town long before Bobby disappeared. But crazily, William was convicted and the Dunbars won custody. Julia would remain in Mississippi after the trial, having many children, becoming a nurse, and becoming a devout Christian, even helping found a church in the area. But she always spoke of the Dunbars kidnapping her son. 30 years later in 1944, one of Julia's children, who was working at his own business, would see a man walk in, and it was Bobby, or Bruce, who had came to see him, and the two conversed for a long time. Bobby/Bruce also dropped in on one of Julia's daughters, which, if he was Bruce, this would be his sister, and the two again talked for an extended period. He was like Bobby, or Bruce, had grown up and now wanted to meet his real family. Heck, when he did grow up and have his own children, he would at one point stop in Poplarville and tell his kids, "This was the family I was taken from." William, on the other hand, served 2 years in prison, was released, and then his lawyer had the conviction overturned. Decades later, the granddaughter of the man known as Bobby Dunbar would begin looking over all the evidence in hopes of proving her grandfather was indeed Bobby Dunbar. Her research, though, led her to believe it was Bruce Anderson, and a few years later in 2004, a DNA test on Bobby Dunbar Jr. revealed he was not related to at least one other cousin in the Dunbar family. I could not find if they tested against any other family members, since reportedly the family was already upset at their granddaughter for looking into this, as they did not want to be part of it. Regardless, this test probably confirmed what we already knew, but it also confirmed one long-held rumor that surrounded the case from the beginning. Heck, I don't even think it was a rumor, because some sources say that Julia and William told authorities the reason the boy was with him is because William's brother was Bruce's father. But since he was born out of wedlock, the family kept it all hushed and did not speak about it. So William was most likely spending time with his nephew, which just makes the whole thing even sadder. Although, having a child with you as a traveling handyman probably made it easier to get meals and shelter. But there are still a few mysteries that remain. First, the big one, what really happened to Bobby? As mentioned, because of the age of this case, and because of all the contradicting reports, that's not even for sure. But I'll list a few of the reports I could find. First, the one that stated the most, the family went camping and fishing to escape the summer heat, and Bobby simply wandered away from the family tent and was never seen again. Another source stated that he was watching a man shoot fish at the lake and disappeared on his way back to the family, while another source states he disappeared in the middle of the night, while another report specifically says he vanished from the tent in the middle of the night. To add to the confusion, one report states he vanished while in the water, and another one would state a family friend took Bobby and some other kids on a hike, and on the way back, Bobby was with the kids, but when they made it back, he had disappeared, while another report cites that he disappeared while with his brother and uncle, or he simply drowned in the swamp. And finally, Bobby was walking with both parents and simply vanished. Then the Dunbars didn't call police for several hours because they assumed he had to be nearby. So you can see why this case is crazy. We don't even know the details about when he vanished, but that still hasn't stopped people from theorizing. First is the one authorities came up with originally. The man witnesses seen on the railroad tracks acting suspiciously that day, abducted, and probably killed Bobby. Others suggest that he fell off the railroad bridge and drowned, and his body was never found, while even scarier theories suggest he was killed by an alligator or was inadvertently killed due to some dynamite being used in the area, which was then covered up, or maybe never even realized. There's also the suggestion that the Dunbars knew exactly what happened to him, possibly an accident due to the Dunbars not watching him close enough, or something more sinister, which might be why they decided to keep Bruce, because they didn't want any further investigation. The other unanswered question is, why didn't Julia identify Bruce right away? And why did Bruce not speak up? The latter question is answered easier. He was just a kid and possibly scared. He would give one interview as an adult where he would give details of the alleged kidnapping, although privately he questioned his identity to friends and family for the rest of his life. Julia not only took a beating in the press about her being an unwed mother, but also because, if it was her son, why could she not identify him? Why did she not report him missing when his uncle had not returned within a few days like he said he would? I cannot find the answer for this, but I'm going to read between the lines and speculate here, which you all know I don't do often. My feeling is that because of the stigma of her situation, that maybe the decision was made to let the uncle raise Bruce, and it's quite possible she did not even see Bruce that much. Of course, I have nothing to base that on. Finally, the biggest question is, did the Dunbars really not know that that was not their son? It's difficult to believe, but if they did, and kept him anyways, why? Did they feel guilty about what had happened, and they were just trying to make things right in their minds? Or, as mentioned, they knew exactly what happened, and they wanted police to stop investigating, so they just went along with Bruce being their son. An awful story, all the way around. Look at this ancient Egyptian artifact dating back to 200 BC and tell me, what do you see? If you said bird, then congratulations, you agree with most scholars, who believe it to be more specifically a falcon. However, if you had the strange suspicion that it might be a glider, or perhaps airplane, or some kind of aircraft, then guess what? You believe what the scholarly community call a fringe theory. Regardless, this piece, called the Saqqara bird, is just one example of a concept, or you may better describe it as conspiracy theory, called out-of-place artifacts. Out-of-place artifacts, or for short, OOPArt, is the theory that revolves around certain archaeological or historical pieces found in unusual places. Sometimes, it's because the artifact is deemed too technologically advanced to have existed in the time frame that it did, like the Antikythera mechanism, which we described in an earlier video, and is often cited as being too advanced for the Greeks of the time, and in turn, it's called an out-of-place artifact, or the Saqqara bird, which we just discussed, which some believe is a model of an aircraft from the time period, thus proving that the ancient Egyptians had mastered flight. The other type of OOPArts are those where an item is found in a culture that should not have had access to it, which leads to a theory where these two civilizations, separated by thousands of miles, somehow had contact with one another. These types of artifacts have opened the door for many different theories, but the huge one is that of the ancient alien variety, which I probably don't have to explain to you, but it suggests that aliens were visiting ancient cultures and helping them, for some reason. While the skeptical theory is that the real out-of-place artifacts, which have been 100% verified to have not been hoaxed, are usually just mistakenly identified as an out-of-place artifact, usually because of the mistaken belief that certain civilizations lack the technology to create it. Since this one is not really a mystery, and more of a concept, we'll just browse over some of the more famous OOPArts, and we'll go back to the most famous one, the Antikythera mechanism, an ancient form of a mechanical computer built between 150 and 100 BC. It was used to predict astronomical positions and eclipses. It is often linked to ancient alien theories, but devices similar to the Antikythera mechanism are mentioned in several Greek and Roman historical accounts. Cicero even gave a detailed description of one, and while advanced for its time, many point out calling it a computer is pretty questionable, and it's pretty limited in what it can do. The main penny, which we have discussed before, was an 11th century Norwegian coin found at a Native American site that many believed showed the Vikings had visited Maine, but it most likely got there through an extensive trade network brought down from Newfoundland, where the Vikings did have a colony. The Tamil bell was a broken bronze bell found in New Zealand by an English missionary in 1836. It was used by the Maori women as a cooking pot. No one was sure how it had gotten there, since it was still early in the exploration of New Zealand, although it's now believed it had been dropped off there much earlier by the Portuguese. The Baghdad Battery is another famous one, which was this pot with a tube of copper and rod of iron that dates back from late BC or early AD. It's long been theorized to be a battery, but it was most likely a place to hold documents. And finally, the famous stone spheres of Costa Rica, noted for their near-perfect roundness, but they were not made by the Atlanteans or aliens, but most likely created by the now extinct Diki civilization, who made them by hammering boulders with rocks and then polishing them with sand, although historians have no idea what their use was, but it was possibly used in lines along the route to the chief's home, or possibly as a representation of the solar system. In 2001, a blockbuster film that would go on to have several other blockbusters would be released, that of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or known everywhere else outside the United States as Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. And while we don't need to go into the plot, the film's name derives from this ancient alchemical idea known as the Philosopher's Stone, and although it's only seen in the first book and last book, it's mentioned throughout the series. But just what did author J.K. Rowling base this on? Why, a real legend, of course. The Philosopher's Stone is a mystical substance that is said to be capable of turning base metals such as mercury into gold or silver. It was a long sought after goal of the earliest alchemists, and it traces its first mention back to 300 AD by a man named Zosimos of Panopolis, who wrote the oldest known books on alchemy, although some writers who have studied alchemy contend the history actually goes all the way back to Adam, who was given the knowledge by God, which was then passed down through the early biblical patriarchs, which resulted in them living hundreds of years. This leads us to the second part of the Philosopher's Stone's ability. It was believed that this powder or mixture that could be used to turn metal into gold could also be used to make an elixir of life, which provided rejuvenation and perhaps immortality. So you can see why so many alchemists were so obsessed with finding that mixture. But does this stone exist, and why was it a stone? The latter part is easier to answer. When the theory that some miraculous substance could turn metal into gold first came about, that miraculous substance was actually a stone. It was over time that the notion was dropped in favor of a powder, or possibly even elixir. This led to the alchemists, who were basically the early scientists, spending many of their days by adding and mixing different compounds, sulfur and mercury the most common two, trying to find the solution of creating gold. And while it seems laughable now, it is important to note that these alchemists who spent all their time fooling around with these different chemicals, well, we have them to thank for chemistry. In fact, it's here that alcohol was created. Nitric and sulfuric acid were discovered. New salts were obtained. The first system of chemical elements were cataloged. Arsenic was discovered, along with zinc and bismuth. The period also created some famous alchemists who would do several things for the world of science. Arnaldo de Villanova was a doctor, actually one of the best of the 13th century, who was heavily rumored to be an alchemist. He is the first one to introduce alcohol as an antiseptic. Paracelsus is known as the father of toxicology, and during his life in the 16th century, he invented chemical therapy and chemical urinalysis. He also reintroduced opium as a painkiller, and he spent most of his life trying to find the Philosopher's Stone, which he hoped he could use to heal people. But the most famous was French alchemist Nicolas Flamel, who spent his life researching it, and was said to be the only alchemist to successfully turn metal to gold and to create the elixir of life. Interestingly, Flamel, who is said to have died in 1412, would have a book published in his name 2 centuries later in 1612. That book documented his search for the Philosopher's Stone and told the story of Flamel coming across this mysterious 21-page book that he purchased in 1357, which he would then spend years trying to decode. He claimed that around 1378, he went to Spain for assistance in helping to translate it, and on the way back, he met a sage who identified the book as Book of Abramelin. With this knowledge, Flamel and his wife allegedly decoded enough of the book to replicate the recipe for the Philosopher's Stone, first producing silver in 1382 and then gold. And strangely enough, Flamel did come into considerable wealth at this time, and we know because he donated so much of it to charity. Even stranger were the several reported sightings of Flamel in the 17th and 18th centuries, where he would presumably be 400 to 500 years old, meaning he just possibly created the elixir of life as well. Of course, most historians believe the book was nothing more than a fictitious work written by an anonymous author using Flamel's name. The stone, however, in addition to immortality and turning metals into gold, had the ability to be used as an energy source which would burn forever in burning lamps, or could also be used to turn common crystals into diamonds, revive dead plants, create flexible glass, or even create a small clone of oneself. The mixture is said to be white for making silver and red when making gold, and as you might imagine, it's almost certain the Philosopher's Stone was nothing more than a legend. September 13th, 1848. Cavendish, Vermont. 25-year-old Phineas Gage was at his job leading a crew working on a railway bed for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. At the time, the crew were using explosives to remove rock from the path. It was around 4:30 this fateful evening when Gage was using a 43-inch long, 13-pound iron tapping rod to pack the explosive powder into a hole in the rock, when suddenly it detonated. Gage was immediately thrown from the spot where he landed on his back several feet away. His men reported seeing him lying while his arms and legs convulsed. As they ran over, it got even worse. There lay Gage with this huge hole in his head. Apparently, that 46-inch, 13-pound rod had entered his left cheek near his low jaw, passed behind his left eye socket, penetrated the base of his skull, traversed upwards, and exited the top frontal skull, and was laying about 25 to 35 yards up behind Gage. The men must have been surprised to see he was still alive, but probably assumed he would not last long. But surprisingly, within a few minutes, Gage, after being helped up by his crew, stood just fine and began speaking and walking like nothing ever happened. Eventually, an ox cart pulled up to give him a ride to town, where he calmly rode a mile into a nearby inn. It's here he would wait to be seen by a doctor, who had to be summoned from presumably further away, because this doctor, Edward H. Williams, would not show up for an hour. Williams would walk in to see something he simply could not believe. Gage would lean his head over, which now had this huge hole in it, and say, "Here's business enough for you." Bystanders at this point had gathered around, because of course, this was the early days of medical care, and this was just a local inn. But Gage began retelling the story of what had happened, and Dr. Williams was skeptical. He simply could not believe it at first. He thought Gage made up the story. Regardless, he would still treat the man. One of the first things Dr. Williams would do would be to note exactly what it was that he seen. He would document that there were visible pulsations in Gage's brain, which he could see through the inverted funnel-shaped hole at the top of his head where his brain tissue was sticking out. He would also note that during repeated vomiting, I assume Gage, not the doctor, Williams would observe small bits of brain matter fall to the floor, which is pretty gross. Remarkably, Gage survived and even reapplied for his foreman job later on, but some things had changed, obviously, and that's why it's on this list as an oddity, because Gage's case is one of the most important in the history of neuroscience. A lot was actually learned from this tragedy, because before this horrible accident, Gage was described by his employer as capable and efficient and had a good work ethic, as well as a dependable manager for his crew. And his crew all loved him and reported he was a good leader. But when he tried to get back to work after his recovery, people noticed a big difference. And we know this because another doctor would enter the scene, a John Martin Harlow, who would document Gage's life after the injury. He would note that the formerly laid-back and dependable Gage was now a volatile and unpredictable man. He cared for no one, and now used a lot of profanity, which he did not before. He was also impatient, and when devising plans for the work crew, he would often abandon them before finishing. Harlow speculated that Gage's brain properties that regulated self-restraint and social etiquette had been destroyed in the injury, causing him to be sorta like a child in those regards. He also noted after taking over for Dr. Williams that Gage was fully conscious but remarked he was tired from the bleeding. Over the next few days, he spoke with difficulty but could remember his friends' names. He went into a coma, which he came out of 10 days later, and 4 days after that, he could walk again. He then began to improve both physically and mentally. Over the next 4 years, though, is when Harlow would note the erratic behavior displayed by Gage. Of course, this was groundbreaking stuff, and the medical community really had no idea what parts of the brain actually caused it. But it was clear listening to Gage's friends and colleagues, he was no longer the same person. This led to some of the earliest theories which showed the frontal lobes of your brain basically control your personality, which is true. Gage would live on for another 11 years before dying from severe epilepsy in 1860 at the age of 36, and there was no autopsy done. But years later, Dr. Harlow had the body exhumed in the name of medical science. Even today, it's studied, with some research suggesting that Gage lost about 11% of the white matter of his brain, which is also linked to Alzheimer's, and it's possible the change in Gage's personality came from early onset Alzheimer's, presumably from the injury, and it's this injury that led medical experts to have a better understanding of the frontal cortex association with language, decision-making, intelligence, and reasoning. It was also learned that, contrary to what science believed at the time, brain lesions did not cause permanent deficits. As Gage recovered quite well and lived mostly a normal life, some psychologists believe he even relearned lost skills, although he could not keep his job as a foreman and went on to work as a coach driver. And before we close this one out, there is a bit of confusion just on Gage's personality before and after the injury. It seems that researchers over the years, particularly Harlow, may have glossed over Gage's pre-injury personality flaws while blowing his post-injury flaws out of proportion, because some actually say he was a mean drunk before the explosion, while others say he was a kind man, and others say that he wasn't that bad after the injury. So we really don't know to this day how much he did change, but the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. January 7th, 1950, at the United States Military Academy, West Point, New York, Peter Haynes would report to his role of charge of quarters, where his duties included guarding the front entrance of the barracks, as well as answering phone calls for the other members of the company. And he would get a call that night that he thought strange because when he answered it, he was greeted by a man he would later describe as tone and rough and patronizing, almost insulting. This man would rudely insist to speak to the 21-year-old cadet stationed there named Richard Cox, but Richard was not in his room, so when Haynes told the man this, he replied, "Well, when he comes in, tell him to come to the hotel. Tell him George called. He'll know who I am. We know each other from Germany. I'm here for a little while, and tell him I'd like to get him a bite to eat." He then hung up. Almost an hour later at 5:30 p.m., a man would enter into the hall that was set up for cadets to meet guests, and the man asked to see Cox. The cadet on duty would call Cox's room, who by this point had returned, and informed him he had a visitor. Cox would then come into the hall and shook the man's hand and seemed like he was happy to see him. Cox then signed the departure book and presumably went to have dinner with him, although this is not what happened, because Cox would return later and tell his roommate they did not go eat, but instead drank whiskey while sitting in the man's car. He slept off the alcohol the next day, got up and went to the departure book and changed his return time from the previous evening from 7:30 to 8:30 to make it look like he had attended the cadet supper formation at 6:30 p.m. It would be the following day, before attending Sunday chapel service, Cox would mention this visitor to his roommates. He then told them he was a former U.S. Army Ranger who had served in the same unit as him in Germany. He said the man bragged about killing Germans in the war and even boasted about cutting their privates off afterwards. He also told him he got a girl pregnant in Germany and murdered her to keep her from having the baby. Although I could not find out if Cox actually believed these stories or not. Later that evening, Cox signed out a second time to go meet the mysterious man and returned at 4:30 p.m. But this time, he did not share details. Over the next 6 days, they apparently did not meet anymore, but one odd thing did occur. He would tell his roommates he hoped he wouldn't have to see the man again. But on the 7th day, Cox would attend a basketball game between Army and Rutgers, and it's at this game Cox was seen talking to a man who may or may not have been the stranger, which I'll come back to. But after this discussion, he would go back to the barracks and sign out to dine with this visitor again, and this time, he seemed disgusted or aggravated to have to do it. But what is so mysterious about this? Well, that's because after Richard left the barracks, he, nor this strange man, was ever seen again, which makes Cox the only West Point cadet in history to vanish. So obviously, whatever happened to Cox had to be related to this strange man, right? But just who was he? Well, going back to the beginning of the story, when Peter Haynes would answer the first call from the rude man, remember when he told Cox the man said his name was George? Well, he could not be sure of that, because he answered so many calls that night that he simply forgot. But he felt like that was the name. Likewise, Cox himself never revealed this man's name to any of his roommates or anyone in the barracks, so the George lead may have been nothing. However, since the man had visited the hall, he was viewed by several witnesses who described him as being just under 6 feet tall and weighing around 185 pounds. He also had light-colored hair and light complexion and wore a belted trench coat with no hat. But now let's get right back to that basketball game when Cox was spotted talking to the strange man that may or may not have been George. The reason no one is sure is because in this sighting, the witness described a totally different person than the man that showed up at the barracks. The man was described as having dark hair and being rough looking. So was this the same man? Was this George? Detectives hoped to find out, because by that night, when Cox had not returned, his roommates became alarmed. He was supposed to return at 11, but when he did not, nothing was thought of it, since sometimes cadets did come in late. But when Cox had not returned by 2:30 a.m., it was reported to a superior, but this officer done nothing either, knowing that sometimes the cadets did stay out all night, even knowing they would be punished. But by the next morning, the New York State Police were notified, along with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Army. The FBI would even be brought in later on. The grounds of West Point were searched extensively by helicopters and troops, while a nearby reservoir was dragged, and the banks of the Hudson River was searched. They even drained a nearby pond, and 3 days later, the public was notified in an appeal to find information. But over the next 2 months, there was not one lead. Meanwhile, investigators dug through Army records trying to find anyone that might fit George's description, and had a pass with Cox. But every time they found someone that fit the profile, they were able to trace that person down and rule him out after discovering he could not have been at West Point when the disappearance occurred. They also thought about connections he may have had in Germany, but his time there was investigated and it all appeared to be normal. They also thought that maybe he just deserted, since he had complained to his mother and girlfriend about life at West Point, but considering he left near the equivalent of $1,000 and 2 suits of civilian clothes, they ruled it out. Then more speculation came about. West Point psychologists assumed that with 2 single men meeting several times, they were probably gay, and the FBI actually looked into this. They even visited gay bars in New York with Cox's roommates to see if anyone could identify this George. They also asked the patrons at the bar if they knew Cox, and these tactics did not work either. The FBI would be told of at least one other rumor, a third-hand story of an employee at a store who allegedly caught Cox and another man in the store's basement having a sexual encounter 4 years prior. But outside of this, there wasn't any real proof or even any real first-hand accounts, and his family and friends dismissed the rumors that he was gay. And I know it doesn't necessarily mean he wasn't, but him and his girlfriend did have plans to marry soon. The case pretty much went cold after this. Authorities had no idea what could have happened. It was like he fell off the face of the earth. But 4 years later, the FBI would receive an interesting tip, and Ernest Shotwell came forward and reported to the FBI that he had seen and talked to Cox at a Washington, D.C. Greyhound bus station restaurant in 1952, just 2 years after he vanished. They would speak, and Cox told him he had resigned from West Point and was moving to Germany. Shotwell would go on to say that Cox seemed startled, unfriendly, and was pretty vague about his plans and left about 5 minutes later. The sighting is important because Shotwell actually knew Cox, as they had been prep school classmates, so it wasn't like he was going off a description alone. He knew him. He also stated he knew Cox had been reported missing, but when he seen him at the bus stop, he naturally assumed he was no longer missing. It wasn't until after he left that he realized the missing alert for Cox was still active. That's when he would call the FBI, and so the FBI would go to this Greyhound bus stop restaurant and interview the employees, and they would confirm the man they seen did resemble Cox. The FBI could not believe it still, and gave Shotwell an intensive interrogation and a polygraph, which revealed Shotwell was telling the truth. The investigators concluded that Shotwell most likely did encounter Cox. Regardless, the case would be closed within the decade, while his family had him declared dead in 1957. Strangely, there was one more sighting in 1960 from an FBI informant who claimed he came into a bar in Melbourne, Florida. He said the man, whom he identified as Cox, gave the name R.C. Mansfield, while people at the bar that knew him as a regular called him Richard. After speaking to this Richard, he was shared details that matched Cox's, and then further revealed his last name was Cox. He went on to state that Fidel Castro's time as Cuba's leader was limited, which is certainly odd, as well as being incorrect, but it's left open the thought that Cox may have been a CIA agent. Now what's interesting here is, the FBI considered this informant to be very reliable. They took this sighting seriously, considering his reliability and the fact that the publicity around the case at this point was practically dead, meaning it was less likely to be hoaxed. Regardless, the case went cold again. It would stay that way for 25 years when a retired high school teacher, Marshall Jacobs, took an interest in the case. He began studying it in 1985 and thought it was crazy that it had not been solved. He then began to do a deep dive on the case, traveling across the country, chasing down old leads as well as new ones. He spoke to many people that knew Cox from high school up to his time at West Point. He even filed FOIA requests which granted him access to files from the FBI, CIA, and the Criminal Investigation Division of the Army. One thing that stunned him right away was authorities never took seriously the lead that Cox voluntarily left, and they didn't really pursue it or follow up on leads that hinted at it. Now former high school teacher Marshall Jacobs believed the man visiting the barracks, George, was actually helping Cox with getting a new identity, new life, and new career. Even more interesting, Jacobs would come into contact with a reporter named Jim Underwood, who had a source in the FBI, who told him at one point they had located Cox and planned to pick him up within 24 hours. Yet, some higher-ranked officers in the FBI called the whole thing off. The source speculated that the FBI did not arrest him for desertion at the request of the CIA. Even stranger, this reporter, Jim Underwood, would also relay that when he was granted access to the Cox files, he found them heavily redacted. The report was given to him missing 165 pages, and a lot of these seemed like they might shed light on what really happened to Cox. However, the fact that it came from a third-hand account makes it hard to say if Jacobs took these rumors seriously. Plus, there's just so many things in this that contradicted each other. Like, if he really left to join the CIA or just to start over with a new identity, why did he leave the money and his gold watch, which he loved, laying in his room? Yet, in an unfinished letter he was writing to his girlfriend, there were passages that suggested he was indeed planning on leaving West Point. But then, several of Cox's friends said he told them that while in Germany, he had testified at a court-martial, or regular civilian court, against a man charged with murder. Apparently, he told a lot of people this, yet the FBI could not find any record that this actually happened. Yet if it did, it could suggest that George was out to get revenge, although that makes you wonder why he voluntarily left with him. The espionage theory also carried some weight, as a John H. Noble, an American living in West Germany that was seized by the Soviet Union and imprisoned in 1955, would tell while at a gulag in Vorkuta, Siberia, he met another American prisoner named Cox, which some believed may have been Richard Cox. According to this theory, Cox left West Point to work for the CIA in West Germany, where he had gotten caught spying. Then there's that FBI informant who met the R.C. Mansfield, who said that Castro would not be around much longer. Yeah, it wasn't long after he said that the failed Bay of Pigs invasion happened. In fact, Jacobs, the teacher who had worked on this case for over a decade, eventually tracked down a soldier who served with Cox in Germany named David Westervelt. He lived in New Jersey and fit the description of George. He was interviewed by police several times over Cox's disappearance. Jacobs believed this David Westervelt was a recruiter for the CIA and that Cox had told him he was unhappy with West Point, seemingly on that first visit George made, and the visits after that was Westervelt helping Cox get out, start a new life under a new name and a career with the CIA. In fact, he would find a retired CIA agent, whom he would not name. The stated Cox worked in a stay-behind team in Europe to help to smuggle Russian nuclear scientists and others out of the Soviet Union. He then quietly retired in Idaho and in the mid-90s succumbed to an illness. But that was just one CIA theory. There was also this rumor that swirled for years of a huge shootout with Soviet agents on the East German border in 1947, where Cox was shot and killed by a Soviet agent. However, to contradict this theory, FBI and Army records pulled via FOIA request showed no security clearances or sensitive military access was ever given to Cox, although the CIA just claimed they had no records on Cox. Another theory was the man known as George simply killed him that night for reasons known only to himself. In fact, if we go back to the beginning of this story, when Cox first went out to drink whiskey with George, there were some sources that stated Cox complained that this man made him drink whiskey, and then insisted they must meet the next day. This has led to another theory that George was actually blackmailing Cox, and then some kind of altercation happened that night, like Cox refusing to pay anymore and threatening to go to police, resulting in George killing Cox. There's also the theory that Cox got into contact with someone who would hook him up with a new identity. In fact, there was a man named Robert Frisbee who was stationed at Fort Knox with Cox and fit the description of George, and in the late 1950s, he started a lucrative criminal business of selling false IDs to a lot of people, which means he could have helped Cox start over somewhere else. But what was Cox running from? The speculation is endless. Some think he was involved in a scandal of some kind, or was possibly tired of living a secret life, which many have suggested he was a gay man, tired of living in the closet. Of course, Robert Frisbee was also tracked down, and he denied that he had anything to do with Cox's disappearance. Cox's family would give interviews over the years where they didn't seem to believe the CIA story at all, and instead believed that Cox had came into contact with the wrong crowd, insisting he would never go his whole life without contacting his family again. And there were some shady things that Cox was involved in. For one, he was rumored to have a big gambling debt, although the FBI nor Army could ever verify this. There were also rumors that he was involved in black market activities while he had been stationed in Germany, although I couldn't find many details about that. Then we come to the more mundane theories, like he simply fell into the river and drowned, or died from hypothermia before he got back to the barracks, because for the record, it was a very cold January night that he vanished. But I know you guys love the more out there theories, so I saved the best two for last. The first being, he was abducted by aliens, and whatever happened from that point is left up to your own imagination. And you know, if the alien theory doesn't take the top spot, then the last theory is going to be absolutely crazy. And it is. Some believe that Cox escaped his life from West Point to become famous actor James Dean. That's right, even though there is only a slight resemblance, and although Cox was born 3 years before Dean allegedly was, some actually think it's possible. According to the little-known theory, Cox fled West Point in January 1950, got a new identity, and pursued acting. 11 months later, James Dean would make his debut on television when he appeared in a Pepsi commercial on December 13th. 2 years later, Ernest Shotwell would see the man he knew as Cox at the Greyhound bus station depot, which many consider this to be the last official sighting of Cox. And then 3 years later, James Dean would die in a car crash after a quick but successful acting career. Then Cox was declared dead 2 years later. I know the theory is absurd, but I love it. But I'll leave it to you. What happened to Richard Cox? Murdered by a stranger known as George? Did he get a new identity and start a new life? Did he become a spy? Or did he spend his remaining years blazing a trail in Hollywood? Let me know in the comment section below. May 25, 1928, Italian Air Force General Umberto Nobile was commanding the airship Italia in a series of expeditions around the North Pole when the airship would begin to lose altitude and start to crash to the ice below, killing one crew member, Vincenzo Pomella, on impact. Luckily, 9 men survived but were stranded on the ice, while 6 others were trapped under the airship's envelope. The crew were now in despair though, as they were in the Arctic, more specifically about 75 miles northeast of Nordlandslandet Svalbard, a part of Norway and a place that's not easily accessed today, and even less so in the 1920s. The survivors acted quickly and soon discovered that many of the supplies still lay intact, along with the shortwave radio, which crazily enough, they soon found a rear engine car that had been smashed onto the ice. They took the material from it and made a radio mast where they soon started sending out SOS signals. Now the reason for this crash is unknown to this day, and is still hotly debated, as it's a big mystery itself, but that's not the focus of this next entry. Because see, as the SOS went out and the news spread, many people would answer the call to go rescue these stranded explorers. One of the men was a famous explorer of the Arctic, a man named Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian who was one of the key figures in an era known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, which took place from the late 19th century up until 1922. He was mostly known as the man who first successfully led an expedition to the South Pole in 1911, and then, on May 12, 1926, almost 2 years prior to the crash of the Italia, was the first to successfully lead an aerial expedition of the North Pole, becoming the first verified explorer to have reached the area, although his claims to being the first reaching the North Pole are disputed by other explorers of the era. But as soon as Roald heard about the men who had crashed in the Arctic, he felt that he could possibly help, and if there was one man in the world you would want to rescue you from the North Pole, that would be Roald. So he began putting together a plan and assembling a team which would come together over the next 2 weeks, and it involved Norwegian pilot and French pilot Leif Dietrichson and René Gilbeau, along with 3 other French crewmen. The team would then set off for the North Pole, where they scoured the area for the airship Italia, and any of the men that may still be alive, but when seeing no signs of either, Roald would make the decision to head back to the nearest Norwegian airbase to refuel. The Latham 47 took off around 4 p.m. and would radio out 40 minutes later at around 4:40 p.m. to ask about the ice conditions. The crew would continue on, and about 15 minutes later, a telegraph operator in Inge would overhear the crew of the Latham reaching out to a radio station in Longyearbyen, only for no one there to respond. Silence would then follow for about 30 minutes, when they would again call in at 6:45 p.m. and report they were about 19 nautical miles south of Bear Island, but again, no response from the station. It would actually take 30 minutes before anyone would call back out to the crew of the Latham, and by this point, Amundsen nor anyone else on the flight would respond. And while it's easy to just say, well, it was the Arctic, and the odds are they just crashed into the ocean and died, there is one big issue with that. The crew were flying in a French Latham 47, which is a flying boat, so unless there was just a huge catastrophe mid-air that caused the airplane to nosedive, there's no reason that the crew should have not been able to land the plane safely and then wait for help, assuming a mechanical issue occurred, or just assuming they had ran out of fuel. Whatever the case, it was really kind of baffling that this airplane could not land safely. Even stranger, once authorities were alerted to the fact that his team was missing, they could not find any trace of them. Just as curious, though, would be all these alleged sightings of the crew and airplane that makes it seem impossible that this plane was not tracked down. Very early in the search for Amundsen, a fisherman came forward to report seeing a gray biplane at an altitude of around 650 feet just northwest of Bear Island. When authorities went to speak to this man, he had already went back out to sea, and they could not get any further info. A week later, a Russian fishing vessel would tell a Russian newspaper that they had seen the Latham and its crew floating on ice just south of Svalbard, yet no information came from this. 2 months later, another fishing vessel would announce they had seen a fire on Edge Island, which is a pretty remote frozen wasteland. Since there were no hunters or anyone else reported to be in the area at the time, rescuers naturally assumed it had to be the crew of the Lednem who had started a fire, but because the conditions were so bad, the fishing vessel could never get close enough to investigate it further. But to make things even crazier, over 70 years later, a 95-year-old woman named Jenny Johansson stated that on that evening, around the time of the disappearance, her and her sister seen a plane out at sea off of Hilosoya. She rushed to get the adults in the family, only for them to arrive and the plane to be gone. What makes this claim so incredible is around the same time this woman came forward, another witness did too, stating they had seen the plane flying at a low altitude not far from where Johansson had seen it. What's not clear about these reports are if the witnesses really waited 70 years to come forward, or if they had came forward previously to authorities and it just wasn't made public until 70 years later. But in the early days of the search, they found nothing. It would actually be a little while later when they found a wing float and the bottom of a gasoline tank, which someone had attempted to turn into a replacement wing float. These items were found near the Tromsø coast in northern Norway. Search and rescue naturally assumed that it had came from the Lednem 47 that the crew had been in, and figured they crashed somewhere in the Barents Sea, and that the crew were killed in the wreck or died soon after. Of course, they could not conclusively link the items to that plane either, but the search was eventually called off, although 5 years later, what was thought might have been an engine was found, and then 30 years after that, in 1964, a plywood panel with the remnants of an electrical device, possibly from an aircraft thought might be linked to the Lednem 47, was found. After this, many other items would be found, but their legitimacy has always been doubted, like 2 separate instances where a message in a bottle was found. These were both later ruled out as hoaxes. The only other 2 things found that might have actually been connected was a skull that was turned into authorities at an unknown date, and then this police department would move to a new building in 1995, and they lost that skull. It wasn't until later that someone suggested that that skull might have been from the crew of the Lednem, but by then it was too late. The second instance was just 5 years after the crash, when a fishing vessel reported catching a large metal object in its trawl, about 6.5 feet long and weighing 440 pounds. Unfortunately, the line snapped before they could get it aboard, and it sunk back into the sea. However, the Lednem was only about 4.5 feet long. Fast forward to 2004 and 2009, the Norwegian Navy would use an unmanned sub to search the 40 square mile area they believed held the remnants of the lost plane and crew, but they found nothing. As far as theories go, there's not many. It seems like a lot of the earliest conjecture was that the fog got so bad they were forced to land in the area to wait it out, but then the sea conditions were so terrible that it eventually destroyed the plane, causing it to sink. However, the repairs to the float and the attempt at using a fuel tank for added buoyancy suggest that the aircraft originally crashed, or at least landed hard in the water, but again, that's only if that float and gas tank was even connected to the aircraft. Another theory actually traces back to just 2 years after the disappearance, when rumors popped up that Amundsen had been found by the Inuit in Greenland, who rescued him. He would then live on with them until the following spring, where he died due to unknown circumstances, and he was then buried on the coast. Likewise, there's a similar theory that he went to live in Alaska with the Inuit, where there were several sightings of him in the 1940s. Not to be outdone, one theory that came about just 2 months later was when a cargo ship off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, said they saw an aircraft lying in the sea. This too led to nothing, however. Then another theory that cropped up in 2017, almost a century after the crash, was the idea that the men began walking to try and find help, only to run into a member of the Italia expedition they were sent to rescue, that of Finn Malmgren, who left the site of the Italia crash to go look for help. He was never found once the rest of the crew were rescued. This theory came from the fact that in 1936, a campsite was found that had items that possibly belonged to both the Italians and Norwegians. Finally, another theory cites that another famous polar explorer, Lincoln Ellsworth, rescued Amundsen, who then went to Mexico and spent the rest of his life there, living incognito. July 1799, 28-year-old Pierre Bouchard, an officer in the French Army of Engineers, had been dispatched to Egypt, where he was put in charge of rebuilding a Fort Julian, an old Mamluk fort near the city of Rosetta, which is now called Rashid. It was during this work that Pierre would make a discovery that some claim is the most important artifact in history. Depending on the source, it either happened on the 15th or 19th of July. While working, Pierre stumbled across what would be called the Rosetta Stone. It's hard to put into terms exactly how big of a deal this was, but right off the bat, without it, we would know basically nothing of the ancient Egyptians, other than what the Romans recorded. The Rosetta Stone is a basalt stone that is 3 foot 9 inches high and 2 foot 4 inches wide, that is inscribed with 3 different writing systems, that of Greek, hieroglyphic, and Demotic, which is the ancient Egyptian script, and of course, 2 different languages, Greek and Egyptian. After France surrendered Egypt to the British in 1801, they would give up the stone as well, where it was then sent to the British Museum, but not before it would be studied. Deciphering the stone would basically come about because of 2 people, Thomas Young and Jean-Francois Champollion. Young was a doctor, physicist, and basically all-around smart guy. Egyptology was one of his hobbies, and he began trying to translate the stone in 1814 and would make several of the first key translations, such as being the first to correctly find the name Ptolemy. His work is seen as crucial to its translation, but since he was involved in so many other projects at the time, he soon stepped out of the way so someone else could put all their focus into it. That would be Jean-Francois, who picked up where Young left off. He had already mastered Latin and Greek and 6 other languages, but of course, no one could understand hieroglyphics yet. But with that, let's back up for a bit for a little history lesson. The story of the stone can be traced all the way back to Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt in 332 BC. After throwing the Persians out of Egypt, he would begin setting up Macedon control over the country. And since Greek was the official language of Macedonia, this would be the language of the governing elite of the people of Egypt, for both native Macedonians as well as the Egyptians who may have taken a puppet role in the new Macedonian-led government. Now these Greek rulers, however, did not speak Egyptian, nor could they read the hieroglyphs, because they didn't need to know it, since if anything needed to get done, it needed to be in the Greek language. You can kinda see where this might upset the Egyptian population. It would take nearly a century, long after Alexander was gone, when Egypt would hit another rough patch. First was when Ptolemy IV and his wife died in suspicious circumstances, but it left their son Ptolemy V in charge. However, he was still a child, so a regency was set up to guide the country until he reached adulthood. Unfortunately for Egypt, they were soon attacked by the Seleucids, a former part of the Macedonian Empire, who then annexed some of the territory of Egypt. By the time Ptolemy V would take over the reins of the country, he was already facing a large revolt by other men who claimed to be the real pharaohs. This fight would go on for just over 20 years, and in that time, Ptolemy would reach adulthood, and a ceremony was carried out which seen him crowned as the pharaoh. Now I told you all that because it was this celebration that the Rosetta Stone was used to commemorate the occasion, and really, the Rosetta Stone is nothing more than a public decree to reinforce Ptolemy's claim to the throne. Some would even say it's just a propaganda piece, but because it was inscribed in both Greek and the Egyptian languages, both Thomas Young and Jean-Francois were able to use the Greek sections to slowly translate the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and script. This would of course lead to the translations of tons of other Egyptian texts that for years no one had the ability to do. It's from this one inscribed stone that an ancient culture cloaked in darkness now had a light shone on it and its inner workings. That brings us to the conclusion of Part 3 of the Ultimate Historical Mysteries and Oddities Iceberg Explained. We are now 3/4 of the way through Layer 1. I hope you enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.